I shall attack you on the plain of Hormizjan at the end of the month. Prepare.
Centuries before medieval knights were seen in Europe, a crown passed from one dynasty to another by the result of single combat between two armored warriors in Persia. Once these highlands of southern Persia had been the heart of an empire. The origins of Persian kingship lay here, in Fars. But then Alexander the Great became the master of Asia, and the great palaces of the Persian kings were devastated. This land, once the home of the most powerful kings on earth, lapsed into a backwater, bypassed by events. Even when Persian power was restored by the Parthians, Fars remained a minor province.
In the 3rd century AD, the great Parthian dynasty was in decline. And here in the province of Fars, there was a minor sub-king called Ardashir. And yet within 20 years, Ardashir had become a rallying point and it inaugurated the great Sasanian dynasty, which was to last for 450 years. And one of his first gestures of independence towards the Parthians was the great palace castle that you can see behind me. Professor Peter Brown, what was the building of this building meant to say in words of one syllable, as it were, to the Parthians?
Well, David, in a language which everyone at the time could understand, it made absolutely plain that this wasn't going to be just the hill fort of a sub-king. It was going to be the great, towering, wide-open palace of a king of kings.
The palace was built where it could be a beacon to the tribes as they rallied to the king. Through this gorge ran one of the main routes from the north to the south of the Iranian plateau. And today, the migrating tribes still pass through it. As the people rallied in their hundreds to the new King of Kings, Ardashir declared the conditions for their allegiance.
My counsel to you is to take horse and come with crown and throne to the king's court. You must hasten your decision without deliberation and come speedily to do homage, lest it end in your being sought out and disgrace coming to you, and yourself being visited by the wrath of the King of Kings.
And if we'd come here as early Sasanians, what procedures would we have been through by now?
Well, we would have tethered our horses, dismissed our retainers, and passed across the great open terrace that gave us this view of the landscape. Passing the terrace, we would have then entered into a great masonry vault. And in the vault, out of the landscape, we would have seen carpets, shimmer of gold. And at the end, Ardashir, standing under the vault with the crown of the King of Kings on his head, waiting to receive us.
And as he stood there to receive us, what would we do?
We'd have fallen flat on our faces and said, "Our hearts burn the majesty of the King."
What exactly does all the emphasis on majesty mean? What's it for?
Well, it's hard to explain to a modern person because this seems pompous, it seems grandiose. What we've got to think of is here we have a society of sub-kings. Every one of them thinks he's the equal of everyone else. So in a sense, they've got to agree that one person is top dog, so that they don't have to be competing with each other the whole time. So in some ways, majesty is an agreement to cut down competition. And in some ways, it's a way in which you agree by allowing another person to be the cat's whiskers.
But he himself, Ardashir, was building something, did build something pretty unique in his time here. Didn't he?
Yes.
The scale of this place?
Oh yes. Well, this is the real Ardashir touch. He really did build big. He used the dome. He used the way in which the square hall for the ceremonies gets covered by a circular dome, using the squinch so that the dome comes out of the square. He used building, he used rock carvings, he used coins. Wherever you water your horse in this valley, you find a rock carving showing either Ardashir defeating his enemies or Ardashir receiving the blessing and the protection of the gods, having defeated his enemies.
It begins to be very clear why Ardashir built his particular palace here, Peter.
Yes, it is, only too clear. It's right on top of the gorge, as high up as it could go, so that everyone entering the gorge and coming from it could see it. And also, of course, in the summer, it's a cool place.
But now this vista, Peter, it's as wide-ranging as the man's life itself. Tell me, what was it that enabled Ardashir in his time and in such a sort of epoch-making way to do so many new things with buildings like this, battles, a new and great empire? What were the qualities he had that enabled him to do that?
I think the really important thing of the next 400 years of Iranian history, of this dynasty, is the way in which, from Ardashir onwards, very quickly, you hit off a style of life and a style of rule. And how this style of life and this style of rule worked. A style of life which recognized that politics was the art of the possible, that a ruler might do great things, might enjoy great prestige, but if he didn't work for it by wooing homage as well as imposing it, work for it by constant journeys, work for it by a whole lifestyle which he would share with those around him and eventually be thought of as a symbol who summed up the values, the religious values, as well as the purely down-to-earth and success values. Somehow the ability to hit off some solution of government in a hard and difficult land of slow communications and of wide horizons.
By 220 AD, the new Persian King of Kings had begun to restore the empire. In the west, Rome was the dominant force, But its power held no awe for Ardashir. He sent a messenger with explicit demands for the return of territory.
My forefathers' empire reached as far as the river Strymon and the boundaries of Macedonia, as even your records bear witness. These lands it is fitting that I should demand, since, and may what I say not seem arrogant, I surpass the kings of old in magnificence. I declare that if this embassy of mine returns unsuccessful, I shall gird myself with all my strength and shall hasten to come.
This truculent message brought no offer of conciliation. Shapur, the son of Ardashir, therefore backed up the words with force.
When the King of Kings goes to war, in a sense, society has to go on parade. It is a society on parade, and a society on parade for war. The Persian class system is very largely the system on which the Persian army was based. These were the men who could afford to breed and feed the horses. Horse after horse after horse after horse. And on them, the nobles of Persia.
The society was divided into 4 estates. The first was that of the clergy, the white-capped priests. The second, the fighting men, cavalry and foot soldiers. The third, the scribes. The fourth, the artisans and the tillers of land. The ambassadors of Sasanian allies traveled too. The Chinese, with whom the Sasanians had trade links, the Arabs, the Huns, and the women of the court with their retinues of servants. The kingdom, founded in Fars by Ardashir, bloomed rapidly into empire. With Shapur's conquests, it reached India in the east, the Mediterranean in the west, a buffer between Rome and Asia. 260 years after the birth of Christ, Shapur crushed a Roman army and captured the Emperor Valerian. Relying on infantry, the Romans were decimated by the Persian cavalry. Horse and rider, both armored, were like tanks. With the innovation of the stirrup, the lance became lethal. Persia's victories were immortalized in stone.
This is the king in action. This is the way in which the divine blessing is shown. Here you have Shapur in his really the greatest triumph, the triumph he wants to really get over. That is a triumph over 3 consecutive Roman emperors. One emperor, Gordian III, lying dead at the horse's hooves. The other emperor stands like a sort of stable boy supporting the king's horse. That is Valerian. The third emperor, Philip the Arab, is a tributary king. He kneels, hands out, offering tribute. So that is Shapur in action.
With their Roman prisoners in ropes, the Sasanians returned to the Persian heartland. The king's victories were his credentials to govern. The tradition of kingly principles was passed down and later recorded in a document known as the Testament of Ardashir.
The superiority of the king over his subjects resides solely in his capacity to perform praiseworthy deeds and noble actions.
Persian confidence came from the top, from the authority of the King of Kings. Every man in his army knew that the king's power was absolute and seemingly invincible. Rome never overcame it. Within their strictly defined order, the Persians felt themselves and their land to be the chosen stretch of the earth.
Our country, though small in comparison with other countries, enjoys more advantages and a more abundant life. All that exists in other parts of the world is brought to our country and is for our enjoyment, be it food or drugs or perfumes. And the King of Kings has cast the shadow of his majesty over all who have sent him tributes.
Despite the growth of their empire, the early Sasanian kings remained faithful to their roots. Here in Fars, Shapur built a new city on the proceeds of his raids into the Middle East and with the help of his Roman prisoners. It became a great commercial center.
Because this is thought to be a temple to Anahita, isn't it? The water goddess?
Yes, this is so, David. The reason is that here you see the water, the temple arranged to receive water pouring in from all corners. Now, it's here because this is the great goddess of water, Anahita, who is also the great goddess of the town and of the area, the goddess who showed by her granting of water that Bishapur and Shapur, who founded Bishapur, the name is Be-Shapur, Shapur's good deed, the way in which he celebrated his great conquest throughout the Near East was to bring a town here, and in the middle of the town, a temple of Anahita.
As it were, the local.
The goddess, which was always the protecting goddess of Shapur, of the Sasanian family, and of the whole area. Yes, this is it.
Now, this is it. In the midst of a 120-degree day, you can see what they meant about water.
Well, this is the water on which the town and the castle depended. This really is the lifeblood of the whole area.
And the castle, in fact, was just over here.
The castle is up there, almost hidden in the rock, so well built as to sort of fit in as if it was just one geological formation among others.
And in addition to the water in the very hot climate here, the strength of that fortification must have been one of the reasons that Shapur picked this place.
Yes, indeed. The town is a prestige town. It lies on the plain, exposed. The real place is the royal fortress and the castle up above the town, which nobody could take.
The mosaics from the palace floors of Bishapur, now in the Louvre, were made by Roman prisoners of war. They show a way of life, a sense of luxury, already far removed from the austerity of the early days of the dynasty. fort seals, too, indicate increasing administrative order, as well as an affirmation of the Sasanian sense of style. Ardashir had decreed that everybody had their place and should keep to it. Shapur knew his place and ensured it for all time by having his image carved out of the rock in this cave, high in the mountains overlooking Bishapur. The king's guardianship was extended through the people to the land.
Things can only be in a good state if there is a good king. Fertility is impossible without rain, which falls in due season. He who contravenes his rank in something is like one who deflects irrigation from plants which need water to those which do not.
Irrigation was crucial to life on the plateau. Since the earliest civilizations, the farmers here had developed ingenious ways of bringing life to the desert. Underground lakes were tapped by building canals, which ran sometimes for up to 60 miles under the fields to irrigate crops. Systems like these were easily destroyed by invaders, and the fertility of the land depended on the security of the empire.
The Shah, in a brief space of time, has made the water to run in the desert, founded towns, created villages, such as had not been done in the whole 1,000 years before him. He has brought architects and built roads.
Shapur's Roman captives brought new skills in bridge and dam building, used in these extensive water systems at the city of Shushtar in southwest Iran. For the people in such a land, the equity of life often rested on the distribution of water. Unless water was shared in equal measure, there would be conflict. The men who controlled the water were called then, as they are today, the mirabs.
بله می‌خواستم بگم اینجا چطور شما آبیاری می‌کنین؟
This mirab explains that he shares this land near Bishapur with 13 others. They tap their water supply and distribute it to each plot, adjusting the flow to conserve water and to avoid loss by evaporation under the fierce sun. Behind the social order was the spiritual order of the native religion, Zoroastrianism. Its god was Ahura Mazda, who held the balance between good and evil, between fertility and drought. Pockets of Zoroastrianism survive in Iran, although Zoroastrians are more conspicuous in India as the Parsis. Shirin lives in the village of Hassanabad in southern Iran. At the dawn of each day, she and her neighbors collect water from the village stream before washing pollutes it. For the Zoroastrians, purity is sacred. Shirin circles her house with fire, a ritual cleansing.
And the various elements that Zoroastrians particularly respected, fire and water and earth and so on, would you say they were the main ingredients of the religion?
Well, look, David, this is what you've got to think about. Here's a world which was made by Ahura Mazda, the god, made to be as good as possible, made in harsh conditions with constant enmity, nature and of the demons. This care of Ahura Mazda for the world was made plain to men in the fire, above all here in the water, and one can see how much one needs it, in the earth that is made fertile by the water.
And what other responsibilities in terms of living did a follower of Zoroastrianism have?
Well, he had to keep things going. It was very much a religion of keeping things going, of keeping the water pure and clean, of keeping the land under cultivation. But then, of course, you can't just have land and water because there are human beings in it. So you've got to keep oneself well organized, in an upright society.
Shirin's is the family house, where she and her relations keep their stores. Early each morning, Shirin prepares the day's bread.
What was the position of women in general at this time in Sasanian society? I mean, were they held in higher or lower esteem than the general norm at that time?
They were held in high esteem because in Zoroastrianism they were, as it were, helpers of the men in carrying out the good deeds of Ahura Mazda. They looked after the things which the men lived from. And so Sasanian history is the history of very important women, important noble women, important queens.
The baking of bread is followed by the burning of incense and by a prayer of thanksgiving, spoken in the Zoroastrian language of Sasanian times. Shirin prays to the 33 angels, each one responsible for a day of the month, each representing a human quality.
They who strive to understand and reach true life should preach the lore of Mazda to mankind better by acts of service than by words.
Priests officiate at a monthly feast in the fire temple of Yazd, an ancient city. It is uncertain when Zoroaster appeared on the plateau, perhaps 1,000 years before the Sasanians. His theology replaced the old pagan rites and influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He gave his followers the choice between Ahura Mazda, the wise and thinking lord, or Ahriman, the devil.
It's very much from very early times, the Zoroastrians were known as the upright men, the men who did not lie. The sort of anti-life principle was always called the principle of the lie, while the good principle was always called the principle of the uprightness.
The produce of the land is important in Zoroastrian ceremonies. From wheat, representing fertility and planted in time to ripen for this ceremony, to juniper, myrrh, eucalyptus, and the evergreens which always grow from the courtyards of temples. Until recently, Zoroastrian corpses were placed in the desert on a tower, the Tower of Silence. Burial in the earth would pollute the earth. Cremation would pollute fire itself. The bodies were left to the vultures, the bones to be cleansed by the sun. Before he dies, a Zoroastrian may will money to hold regular feasts, so that the community should remember him. This distribution of food is not merely symbolic. Better off people can give food to the temple for the poorer ones. In the inner sanctum of the temple is the sacred fire, kept burning permanently, a flame that often marked the partnership of God and the Sasanian kings.
This really is a majestic rock relief here, Peter, and both figures look almost godlike.
Well, David, I think that's part of the whole point of the rock carving. You see, this is a rock carving which shows Ahura Mazda and the king as exact mirror images. You see the way they're carved. It's like as if they've been cut out of a bit of folded paper. The front leg of each horse, perfectly carved, so well carved you can see the artery running down it, are exactly equal. And this is the way of showing that on earth the king is the visible co-god, the equivalent of the invisible God. The invisible God overcomes his enemies in the universe at large, and the visible king, as you see with the fallen enemy at his feet, overcomes his enemies in the world that we can see.
And gods approve of battles in the human world for that reason.
Oh yes, indeed, because that is the way in which the order of the good society can be made plain in the world we can see as well as in the world that we can't see.
And what is the king, what is Shapur exactly being presented with?
Well, he is reaching out his hand to receive the ring of kingship, the ring of empire over the world, over the bit of the world which he controls. And he has gained it by his conquest.
And within this tradition then, if a king lost, did he lose because he had already angered the god, or did his defeat then anger the god?
That's something which, on the whole, the Sasanians, being on the whole successful kings, didn't spend much time worrying about.
But in the cases of where they had their periods
where they
of
had their
defeat,
periods of
was
defeat.
it because they had angered the gods, or that their defeats then angered the gods?
No, it was because they had angered the gods.
And it was a punishment?
It was a punishment.
In the second year of Peroz's reign, the air dried up, and water in the channels became as scarce as musk. So it was in the third year, and the fourth, and because of the drought, no man was left with sufficient food. The mouth of the atmosphere became as dry as the dust, and in the channels, water was rare, until, because of the multitude of dying men and cattle, there was not room to set foot on the surface of the earth.
An even worse punishment was the decimation of the Sasanian king, Peruz himself, and his nobles by the Huns. Within half a century, Persia recovered. The silk route from China reopened, and camel trains linked the plateau with Eastern Asia. The nation was more than ever at the hub of international trade.
Peter, Firuzabad was one of the largest Sasanian cities, but there's something curiously symbolic about the way it's designed, isn't it?
Oh yes, David. This town, with its round circular wall, at every point of the compass, a gate leads out. So it is a perfect symbol of the city and the empire as lying at the crossroads of Asia. It sums up perfectly the way the Sasanians thought of themselves. They were very well aware that they lived in the center of Asia. They knew of China far to the east, of Central Asia to the north, of India to the south, and away in the west they knew of the Roman Empire.
Obviously, if you're living at a crossroads, commerce is very important, but what sort of trade in particular was the most important?
Well, they were at the end of the trade routes, and they had to make sure that they controlled the raw materials that didn't go anywhere else. So there were problems almost of industrial espionage. How to make sure that the silkworm didn't come outside Iranian territories. So in the middle of the 6th century, Byzantine merchants took the silkworm all the way from Afghanistan, hidden in their bamboo walking sticks, so as to introduce the growing of silk into the Roman Empire and hence into Western Europe. Then there were the Persian horses themselves. They would be shipped out of the Persian Gulf ports, and they'd go to the kings of southern India. But the Persian merchants were careful never to send any horse doctors. So in this strange climate, the horses would all die off predictably, and you'd get a really rapid turnover.
And with all this trading going on in and out of the country and so on, obviously a very great interchange of ideas was taking place, a sort of cosmopolitanism.
Oh yes, most certainly, David. This was part of the whole Sasanian way of doing things. Good example, in the 6th century, you have at the court of Khusro Anushirvan a Persian doctor, Borzoi, who'll travel all the way to India, translating Hindu books. His commander-in-chief would be a Christian, an Armenian from the mountains of the north, and Khusro's great successor, Khusro II. His favorite wife was the beautiful Shirin, who was also a Christian lady from the provinces of the extreme south.
And were people shocked when the king married a Christian?
Oh no, David. That would be like sort of electing a member of parliament. You see, Shirin is a noble woman from this important industrial province of Ahvaz, would be the link between the distant court and the province, and its vested interests.
But as you say, she went on to become the favourite wife. For how long?
For the full 30 years.
Until the end of his reign?
Until the end, when Khusro was declared deposed, when the rebel armies were closing in on the capital. Khusro decided not to flee. He just retired to Shirin's apartment.
It's a very romantic story, isn't it?
It is. It's one which the Persians still make poems about.
On a tide of great wealth, the Sasanian kings had turned their backs on the plateau and moved to lusher Mesopotamia, building this great palace at Ctesiphon. With it came a change in the order of Persian society. In their alliance with the king, the Zoroastrian priests had grown powerful. But now they were demoted by King Khosrow I, who replaced them with bureaucrats, reformed the taxes, and earned the title of Khosrow Anushirvan, Khosrow the Just. Khosrow's coins bear the legend, "He delivered the world from fear," marking Persia's destruction of the Huns. Military resurgence continued under Khosrow II, who within 16 years had pushed west into Egypt and to the walls of Byzantium, seeking to restore the ancient Persian Empire. But at its peak, the cosmic power of the king contracted the seeds of its own downfall, delusions of grandeur.
The throne was placed at the end of the room with the king seated behind a curtain. Suddenly the curtain opened, and the King of Kings appeared on his throne. His crown was of pure gold, and had pearls the size of sparrows' eggs. It was suspended above his head with scarcely visible chains, since it was too heavy to wear.
The style of kingship grew more blatantly excessive.
Know that the king should not be greedy, since greed involves interest in things unworthy of a sovereign. The king should not be given to vain amusements and frivolity, nor has he the right to be idle.
But these cautionary words of Ardashir's were forgotten.
When the sovereign isolates himself from people, the shadows of ignorance envelop him.
Heedless, Khosrow II went hunting. 4 centuries later, memory was still vivid enough to pass into the epic Book of Kings by Ferdowsi.
One day, the Shah conceived a longing for the chase, and made all ready in the fashion of ancient kings. There were brought along 300 horses with golden trappings. On foot, there were 1,000 loyal slaves with javelins in their hands. Also, there were 700 hounds collared in gold which seized gazelle at the gallop. Accompanying all were 2,000 minstrels ready to play airs. Before all went 500 camels, especially picked for their beauty. The whole road was sprinkled with water, which you might have thought was rose water, mixed with amber, to ensure that if a breeze suddenly sprang up, it might not settle dust on that felicitously born king.
While the king indulged his pleasures, his western expeditions collapsed within 6 years under a brilliant counterattack from Byzantium, and the excesses of the court alienated the people of the Persian heartland.
Well, Peter, the Sasanian palace behind us fell into gradual disuse, but the end of the Sasanian era itself was anything but gradual, wasn't it? Were there specific reasons for their vulnerability to such a sudden collapse?
Well, David, you know, in the ancient world, all empires are as fragile as foam on top of the ocean. Everything that counted in favor of the Sasanians in their days of success, their size, their long horizons, these counted against them. As soon as the capital was lost, as soon as the rallying point of the King of Kings was on the move in flight.
But there were also other sort of specific factors of alienation and so on abroad in the society, weren't there?
Yes, there was the strain of war and the strain of the classes falling apart. The court isolated with its policies, looking towards the west, towards the final conquest of the Roman Empire, alienated from the great landowners on the plateau. And on the plateau itself, the great landowners no longer able to keep the loyalty of their supporters. What they felt was that they had no protectors left. Nobody came to make sure that the irrigation dikes worked. Nobody gave them the protection of sure arms. And so they would shrug their shoulders.
The Sasanian Empire came to that very sudden and very dramatic conclusion, as we shall see in more detail next week. But a number of the qualities we've seen that make up the Sasanian style and so on were to survive, weren't they?
Oh, yes. Well, I think in two ways. First of all, there is this sense of a style of rule, and a style of rule controlled by the general values of the society. This meant that throughout the Near East, even until today, if you want the idea of a just king, you think of Khusro Anushirvan. And then on the more humble level, but the one that will really survive, these are the values summed up in the Zoroastrian faith. The values that lead to the preservation of the good things of life, the good things which the gods gave to the land of Iran: water, green, organization. And it is the dogged determination that these things, that what they would have called the good things of Ahura Mazda, should continue in a land where they can never be taken for granted.
Where is Khusro Anushirvan, the best of kings? Where is Shapur, gone before him? Death has not respected him. His power is shattered. The crowds no longer press at his gate. Where are these kings which the winds of the east and the winds of the west have swept away like dry leaves?
The wave that now swept over the plateau was of a different people, the people of the desert, nomads, tent dwellers, and people consumed by the zeal of a new faith. It was more than an invasion. It was the coming of a new and permanent theology. Sometimes, when the end is near, it takes time to realize it. Some of the Sasanians retreated to this redoubt on the top of a mountain. They seemed to think that if they stayed up here long enough, the Arabs would simply go away.